Well, Dr. Farrell, we're live, and I've tried to put on a nice shirt and be attractive for this whole thing, and put on my best. At the last minute before the show, I realized I was wearing nothing but an undershirt, which is,
Oh, well, that's not good.
yeah, very. My father, I grew up with my father in the military. He wore undershirts for everything, because you can
Yep.
throw those out. He said, you get grease, axle grease on it, you toss it.
Yep.
Well, all right. So, Dr. Farrell, I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about bacteria, if you're interested.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
germs, things that crawl up the back of our necks when we're not looking,
Viruses.
viruses. I don't really know the difference between a germ, a bacteria, and a virus, but maybe I can find out in the
I don't
course of
either.
Neither of us are. I think we took some criticism in one of our things with you guys are not experts on evolution, or you're not paleontologists. And I'm like, who told you we were paleontologists? I mean, yes, we're not experts.
Apparently, no one can have an opinion about anything anymore unless they've got a degree in it. I mean, that's absurd.
Yes.
It's just nuts.
So I think issuing a disclaimer at the beginning, I am not a virologist. Neither are you, to my knowledge. And
No.
so I'm viral, but I'm not a virologist. And so I don't know enough about viruses to be a smart guy about them, but I do know enough to ask questions that make you go,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
All right. So the first thing I want to bring up is Plum Island as background. As you know, at the beginning, sometimes we do background.
Mm-hmm.
And for anyone that doesn't recognize Plum Island, it has to do with the possible origins of Lyme disease.
Right.
And so I'm going to read an excerpt from the Wikipedia entry on Plum Island. At least I believe it's the Wikipedia entry, or it could be some bizarre blog post I found. I didn't write down where I got this. But the gist of it is still the same. I'm pretty sure this is Wikipedia. The original anti-animal BW mission was to establish and pursue a program of research and development of certain anti-animal BW agents. In other words, to find ways to wipe out animals. By August 1954, animals occupied holding areas at Plum Island, and research was ongoing within Building 257. The USDA facility, known as the Plum Island Animal Disease Center, continued work on biological warfare research until the U.S. Army program was ended by Richard Nixon in 1969. The bioweapons research at Building 257 in Fort Terry was shrouded in an aura of mystery and secrecy. And the existence of biological warfare experiments on Plum Island during the Cold War era was denied for decades by the U.S. government. In 1993, Newsday unearthed documents proving otherwise, and in 1994, Russian scientists inspected the Plum Island research facility to verify that these experiments and indeed ended. So originally, it was thought that the Plum Island Research Facility, which is in the Long Island Sound off of Flushing, New York, which is part of the city, part of New York City, part of Queens, it was thought to have been for the kind of animal research to wipe out diseases among animals. And in fact, unfortunately, it turned out to be that may have been some superficial part of the study, or may have been the original idea, but it quickly became a way of weaponizing viruses in order to kill animals, which is quite the opposite thing. So going on and finishing out this bit about Plum Island, in 2004, attorney Mike Carroll published Lab 257, the disturbing story of the government's secret Plum Island germ laboratory. Many of the assertions and accusations made in the book are counter to the government's position. That's shocking right there, and have been criticized and challenged. The review in Army Chemical Review concluded Lab 257 would be cautiously valuable to someone writing a history of Plum Island, but it is otherwise an example of fringe literature with a portrayal of almost every form of novelist style. The book advances the idea that Lyme outbreaks have originated at Plum Island, and conjectures several means by which animal diseases could have left the island. And of course, we're talking about the emergence of Lyme disease in Lyme, Connecticut, which is on the Long Island Sound, and so very close to Plum Island. And ideas about how germs could get off this supposedly secure facility, which include things like a belief that, well, rats can't swim that far, but then, of course, seabirds eat the rats and they can fly that far. So Sandy Miller Hayes, a Department of Agricultural spokesperson, the Department of Agriculture has never liked this explanation, told the Associated Press that Lyme disease has never been studied at Plum Island, which isn't the same thing as saying it didn't originate there. It's saying that we didn't specifically study that there. Yeah. Not quite a denial, right? In response to the 2004 incidents, New York Senator Hillary Clinton and Congressman Tim Bishop wrote a letter to the Department of Homeland Security regarding their concerns about the center's safety, saying, quote, "We urge you to immediately investigate these alarming breaches at the highest level and to keep us apprised of all developments." Okay. So as sort of preface for our exploration into all things bacterial, my question to you is, do you think it's credible, first, that Lyme disease originated on Plum Island? And do you think it is plausible that Plum Island, which still engages in all kinds of laboratory research of diseases and bacteria for animals, that Plum Island is, B, not actually secure, that we're dealing with something that can easily leap from a land-based island source to places like Lyme, Connecticut, or New York, whether or not that happened with Lyme disease? And 3, do you think it's possible that the weaponized germ warfare components of that research were never, in fact, shut down?
Okay. Yeah, I do think it's credible. And it's interesting that you picked Lyme disease. It's kind of a synchronicity working here, because just last week, someone sent me, one of our article contributors sent me, and this strikes close to home because as you know, I used to know Bishop Charles Boynton, one of the traditional Anglican bishops back in the day, very elderly man, but I knew both him and his wife, Dory Boynton. And Dory Boynton was a Lyme disease sufferer, and it just gave her tremendous pain. And she was convinced that it was some sort of thing that had gotten out of control, if I remember correctly. And she presented me with a lot of evidence and so on. I never have blogged about Lyme disease particularly, but then this last week, one of our regular article contributors sent me an article about a Swiss doctor that had been doing Lyme disease research that had been suppressed. And I don't recall that it was directly connected to Plum Island, but his research was connected to I think Fort Detrick or the other fort down in Maryland that also does biological warfare tests. My problem with Plum Island is precisely its location. I'm with you. I think it would be easy for things to get out in spite of the strictest controls, particularly since Lyme disease tends to be a tick-borne disease. So, birds or anything like this, picking up bugs, eating them, and so on, and then, defecating elsewhere, can spread the disease, I would think. So I do think that in spite of safeguards, there's always dangers of these things getting out. Let me give you an example, completely unrelated, but I think given the list of articles that you sent, I think I know where you might be going with this. I'm kind of guessing here, but I also blogged this last week about bent grass, GMO bent grass that's gotten out of control in Oregon, and it's spreading like wildfire in Oregon, causing all sorts of difficulties for the farmers there, trying to keep it out of their irrigation ditches and out of their fields and so on and so forth. And of course, this stuff is Roundup resistant. You can't kill it with herbicides. It's just growing like wildfire. So my problem with all of these things is that in spite of the best intentions, there seems to be some sort of ability of these types of things to get out and get into the general population. So I don't have any problem right off the top of my head with the idea that Lyme disease may have spread. And I go back to Dory Boynton's case here. Bishop Boynton had been for quite some time before he broke with the Episcopal Church. He had been the dean of the Cathedral of St. John the Divine down in Manhattan. So, he was from the New York area. He and his wife both were from that area. And somehow, you don't think of ticks being present in New York City. So, how does she get, get Lyme disease? But she did somehow. So I have no problem with it, just based on personal experience with it of people that I know that have had the problem. Plum Island itself, I'm not that familiar with. I don't recall in what little I know about the place that it was ever a facility that was on as tight of a lockdown as places like Fort Detrick or those other places. So I can see diseases getting out of that facility quite easily.
Well, definitely according to contrarian accounts of Lyme disease that reference Plum Island, they tend to reference an overconfidence that the protection of surrounding water, the moat, if you will, is sufficient. And they point out the naivete of that, even if the narrative isn't true, that there are many ways for any infected creature on the island to infect creatures that aren't currently on the island. Not the least of which is human lab workers, et cetera.
Right, exactly.
But the other obvious possibility is, what if there are ticks on the island, and
exactly,
you get bitten by one and you carry it on the ferry and you get back to
exactly.
Now, I will say, for those that don't know New York, and there's all kinds of stereotypes about New York. People seem to think Manhattan is some central place for the rich and don't realize it includes Harlem, for instance, and Central Park. People seem to think it's like it was in the 70s and 80s with gangs and muggings going everywhere. I don't even know anybody that's ever been mugged, and it's very different in that way now. But also, New York City occupies sort of a little foot at the southern base of the state, very much like Cape Cod in Massachusetts. And the upper portion of the state, the vast bulk of the state, is referred by New Yorkers as upstate.
Upstate, yeah.
And upstate is widely sort of, the source of comedy for its rednecks, our four-wheel drives, and the usual sort of...
it's almost a different state.
It's basically Kansas as part of New York, and so it's definitely full of ticks. One of the things that you constantly hear warnings about is if you're going to go hiking, but even on that little foot, I mean, it's very well connected to the state, and there's a lot more wilderness and wildlife areas so all around and within New York City than people give it credit for. So in Flushing alone, you can walk around in the swamp in Flushing, New York, which is part of Queens, if you want, and look out across the Sound and easily get ticks there. So I'm not surprised. You may not get a tick on the subway unless the guy next to you slept there and had them, but you never know.
Well, it's the whole area around New York City. Yeah, you're right. It doesn't take very long once you get out of the city and you're in some pretty rugged country. The same on Long Island. You get out toward the end of Long Island and you're in pretty much wilderness areas in some of those places. So yeah, I can see it easily spreading from Plum Island, say, up to Newburgh and then down into the city, or from Plum Island out to Long Island and then back into the city. It wouldn't surprise me at all. And to his credit, I think that may have been one of the reasons that Nixon shut it down. Nixon did not, to my knowledge, shut down all of the biological warfare sites, but that one, I think probably he exercised some good judgment, because that's just too close to a major populated center to be conducting research like that. It's nutty. And the idea that they can contain this stuff, I find that very disturbing, given all the other evidence that we've had out there, GMOs and all of the other things that get out into the population in spite of their best intentions.
Well, the location of Lyme, Connecticut as well, which is,
Hmm.
you could practically throw a baseball from New York City and hit it.
Right.
It's very rural. Not
Hmm.
only are there plenty of farms in Lyme, Connecticut and in surrounding areas, but it's the birthplace of American Impressionism, which means it's
Right.
inherently pastoral and natural,
Right.
and it's all about landscape. And of course, it wasn't far from there in Wethersfield, Connecticut, that they found the so-called Montauk monster. And
Hmm.
this was rumored to be almost an island of Dr. Moreau thing as a
Right.
result of the Plum Island facility. So this
Right.
creature washes up on shore, and they can't figure out what it is. It's got too many limbs or something like that, and so they notice that it's a bizarre looking globule with legs, and so
Hmm.
they a white globule, and so they look at this thing, and somebody comes down and says, well, it's got the feet of a raccoon, so it's probably a raccoon. Problem is, when have you ever seen a snow white raccoon? But the other thing is, you would expect a raccoon to be a little bit less gelatinous than this thing was.
Yeah, I've seen it.
And so the rumor of we'll put a link to it in the show notes, but the rumor is that men in uniform showed up, made that the official story. It's just a raccoon, and took away the Montauk monster, and it was never to be heard from
Right.
again. And one of the problems was also that the largest recorded raccoon ever was 62 pounds, at least in the modern era, and this thing was way bigger than that. So it doesn't really fit with the Men in Black explanation.
Well, the Montauk monster, I've seen pictures of that thing, and there, if I recall correctly, Daniel, there is a school of thought out there that believes that that thing was actually some part of some cross
Right.
genetic miscegenation that was taking place at Plum Island as well. So, again, if that's the case, then something got away from them, and
Right.
if that thing can get away from them,
The
then
thing's got like the head of a dog, head of a
yeah,
pit bull, the snout of a rhino,
yeah,
and raccoon feet, and something that I won't even go into its private parts, but it's an abnormal looking critter to be sure,
right.
and remind people associate it with that sort of island of Dr. Moreau thing.
Hmm. Yep, exactly.
Well, all right. So I've got a couple of other background things as we proceed. You think you know where I'm going, but I wonder, do you really?
Probably.
So,
No, I only had time to read that. Listen, I only had time to briefly scan through that Atlantic article that you sent. That was the one that was most interesting to me. So
well,
I think maybe I know where you're going, but I don't.
let's move to the next subtopic, which is the flu. So, you blogged recently about a potential universal flu virus that modifies DNA,
Right.
or at least attaches itself to DNA.
Hmm.
And so the question I have is, there's been an obvious uptick in media of emphasis on getting a flu shot, protect yourself against the flu. And growing up, I was never afraid of the flu. I didn't want to get measles,
Right.
but even like chicken pox didn't bother me. The flu, what's that? It's just a cold that lasts 3 days instead of one, and so on. Now, the logic behind this uptick is the development of additional strains of flu that are highly resistant to vaccine. And the problem I have with that is, then what good does it do to get you a flu shot? So if they're resistant to the flu shot.
Right. Exactly.
So it's a little bit of a mystery to me that I may be dense, but I don't think they're explaining it to the common man in a way that that a person with a common body of logic could parse this sensibly. But I understand that there are some pretty bad strains of flu that go on, or that are happening right now. And we talked last time about rapid evolutionary shifts, the ability of
Right.
long periods where things stay the same, and then a short burst of sudden rapid evolutionary changes. That's
Right.
the theory of punctuated equilibrium. And so let's assume that these are not cooked up in a lab and have reached shore off of some version of Plum Island or outside of some military base, that they weren't originally intended to be weapons, etc. Now, we know that that's not entirely true. We know that weaponized forms of flu do exist in germ warfare studies, and they are being worked on actively, and certainly stored by some countries, including ones that aren't supposed to store them. My question is kind of a general one. What's so bad about the flu? Is it the same flu when we say it's a different strain of flu? Is it the same flu naturally mutated, or is it the same flu in a way that natural mutation cannot account for its current level of deadliness? Is that mutation normal, or is it being guided? And potentially, are we looking at a weaponized version of the flu that escaped the lab, and so that's the real source of this
wow.
frantic behavior around getting everybody a flu shot?
That's a very good question. Let me put the record straight. I'm not against vaccines. I blog a lot about vaccines and vaccine safety because I'm very concerned about it. And one of the reasons I'm concerned about it is there is, as far as I can tell, enough scientific evidence to suggest that there is some sort of connection between these cocktails of vaccines that they give infants now that they never used to do. When I was growing up, doctors were very reluctant to give all these cocktails of vaccines to infants, and that has changed dramatically since I was a boy. And the reason that doctors back then didn't do that was that they knew from vaccination studies, you look these up, that over vaccinating actually tends to suppress the natural immune system. And there is credible evidence, in my opinion, that these cocktails have some connection to the rise of autism in children. And to me, this is a huge problem because, you know, a family with an autistic child, I think Catherine Fitz did a study on this, ends up during their lifetime of having to pay out something like $5 million. You know, an average family trying to raise an autistic child is just being bled dry by pharmaceuticals and so on to try and treat the disease. And there is this vaccine link. So that's my personal interest. But on the other hand, you know, I've had vaccinations, and I'm not just opposed to the whole idea of vaccines either. I have questions about some of the new vaccines. And since you're raising the topic of the flu, here's my problem with this. I don't know if you're aware, but DARPA, Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, or as one of our website members likes to call it, the Diabolically Apocalyptic Research Projects Agency, has made as one of its goals to come up with a universal vaccine against everything, not just flu, but against everything. And what that tells me right away is that if they're doing research on the vaccine, then they're also doing research on the pathology of all sorts of acute diseases. And in the process, what they're probably also doing is they're probably trying to create the strongest strains of various diseases, Lyme disease, flu, and so on and so forth, that they can in order to test their universal vaccines. So I do not put it past, again, the possibility that these things may have gotten out into the public, and that this may be why they're doing this, this vaccine hysteria. And my other problem here, Daniel, is, and I've blogged about this, I've talked about this, we've even talked about it in vid chats. My other problem is that every year around flu season, you see Walgreens, CVS, and, you know, all of these different companies, Walmart, pushing flu vaccines on people. And my mother was very religious about this. She would always get these dang vaccines, and she would always pressure me to get them. Have you had your flu shot? Blah, blah, blah. And I'd say, no, I don't get those things. And she says, well, what happens if you get the flu? And I say, well, I suffer through it and, you know, take care of it. But I don't get sick like you do after you've had the vaccine. This would always happen with her. She would get sick and feel run down and tired and achy and all of this stuff for days after getting these things. And I just said, well, why don't you go without it 1 year and try it. And she did. And after that point, she never took another flu vaccine. So my other problem with this is I think you're dealing with a business culture with big pharma that's simply pushing products out there to increase their bottom line. And there may not even be a real genuine need for a lot of these things. And I reference in that respect a Goldman Sachs study. I think it was done either last year or a couple of years ago, sometime in that time frame, that said that basically the way the healthcare industry is set up, it's not designed to cure anything. It's just designed to sell products. And this is my other big problem with this flu vaccine push. I think a lot of it could be also just simply trying to get people to buy product and increase the bottom line when there is no real health threat or benefit to a lot of this stuff. And that's my other big concern here. We're treated to a new flu strain and a new vaccine it seems every year. Well, how do you test a vaccine against a new flu strain adequately under those circumstances? And my guess is you probably can't. You're giving people something that you don't know the long-term intergenerational and potential environmental effects of this stuff. And, we saw this happen with GMOs. There was no real genuine intergenerational testing of some of this stuff that ever took place. And, now we're finding out that there's a connection between glyphosate and cancer and all of this stuff. So that's my big problem with a lot of this vaccine push, is I think that you're dealing simply with corporations interested in increasing their bottom line. Can't hear you.
I want to, for the sake of time, provide a couple of other background pieces. We would normally take these in shorter stints, but we have a shorter session today. So I'm going to just mention briefly in passing that if bacteria survives in space, which now we've determined it does,
right,
on the surface of rockets, then we can safely determine that bacteria could survive those waters in Long Island Sound pretty easily. Sure. On the hull of a boat, or the edge of a briefcase, or just almost any number of other methods. So pretty easy to get them from a lab to the wild. And of course, there's been any number of hypotheses about the origins of HIV and other things. But let's stay on the flu for a second. So referring to the Spanish flu. So the Spanish flu is considered the mother of all flu epidemics.
Right.
I'm going to read this little passage. We often hear that 1918, 1919 flu pandemic labeled the Spanish flu. And this is from Wikipedia. However, the first cases of influenza occurred far away from neutral Spain at the military base Fort Riley in Kansas. On March 4th, 1918, company cook Albert Gitchell reported sick with a fever of 40 degrees Celsius at Camp Funston at Fort Riley. Within days, 522 men reported sick, and by the end of the month, 1,100 soldiers were committed to the hospital with influenza. Among them, 237 developed pneumonia, 38 died, approximately 20% of those hospitalized. So if the pandemic started in Kansas, why was it called the Spanish flu? Historians still debate this misnomer, but the most likely explanation is due to the early affliction and large mortalities in Spain, where it allegedly killed 8 million people in May 1918. That in and of itself might not seem all that interesting, but it's interesting to me because, at least of the hypothesis, that it began in American military installation. But then would there have to have been a lab there? So I'm going to read this next bit, and this comes from Telesurf TV, an English news blog. The documents also showed, this refers to staged terror incidents and anti-animal studies at Fort Detrick and Eglin Air Force Base. The documents also showed that the CIA considered staging several terror events, and this is referring to the anti-Castro events, even bombings in Miami and other U.S. cities to foster a terror threat, which it would in turn be blamed on the Cuban government. So bomb Americans, blame the Cubans. We would develop false flag. We could develop a communist, this is a quote, we could develop a communist Cuban terror campaign in the Miami area, in other Florida cities, and even in Washington, unquote, read one of the reports. The plan also included a possible attack on migrants leaving Cuba to settle in the United States. It went on to read that, quote, we could sink a boatload of Cubans en route to Florida, real or simulated. We could foster attempts on lives of Cuban refugees in the United States, even to the extent of wounding in instances to be widely publicized, unquote. And then it goes on to say that field testing of the biological weapons was completed covertly and successfully with stimulants and agents dispersed over wide open areas. The first American large-scale aerosol vulnerability test occurred in the San Francisco Bay Area in September 1950, using, and it mentions a couple of different types of bacteria. And it talks about how those things were chosen, but basically their similarities to anthrax were part of the deal. And another part of it was because there was a red pigment that made them easy to identify and track. In 1966, the New York Metro was infamously contaminated with another bacteria in an attempt to simulate the spreading of anthrax to a large urban population. Of course, we were all around when that hit the news. And more field tests, and almost nothing is made of it today, that New York subways were used as an experiment. More field tests involving pathogenic species were conducted at Dugway Proving Ground, Utah, and anti-animal studies were conducted at Eglin Air Force Base, Florida. At the time, many scientists disagreed with the creation of biological weapons. He goes on to talk about warnings that they gave. In 1945, one of those left Camp Detrick during a period in which scientists could publish the results of their research still. And he published Peace or Pestilence in 1949, which explained his views on why biological weapons should be banned by world powers. It goes on to talk about different arguments in biological warfare. But it makes the point that many of the breakthroughs included new production plants for anthrax, anti-crop agents, the development of the cluster bomb, and that the U.S. public was unaware of most ongoing studies, including environmental and open air incidents that were taking place. In other words, right here. One of the most controversial experiments was 1951, when a disproportionate number of African Americans were exposed to a particular fungus to see if they were more susceptible to infection. Obviously, that's a cover. It's to test the infection on a black populace. Right. And some scientists realized that reasoned that such knowledge would help them prepare a defense. But the same year, workers at a Norfolk supply center were unknowingly exposed to those same funguses. And it goes on to talk about other cases, the decade-long experiment on volunteer Seventh-day Adventist servicemen, which exposed them to tularemia via aerosols. Now, of course, they were, as I understand it, essentially people that didn't want to fight. And so they stepped up for this. But they were lied to. Essentially, they were told that the goal was to protect us from this type of warfare, when in fact the goal, unknown to the volunteers, was to standardize a tularemia bomb fill for attack on civilian populations. So it was the exact opposite of what they were signing up for. In the 60s, the U.S. changed its approach from biological agents aimed to kill to those that would incapacitate. And so it goes on to talk about different food poisonings and other things that prevent treatment of diseases. And it talks about various pathogens that cause a myriad of diseases. So the idea is that it's not noticeably germ warfare. It's something that creates a situation where you die, but it can be blamed on the symptom of the thing that killed you, the disease or whatever. And then finally, the Vietnam War brought public awareness to the U.S. biological weapons program. The use of chemicals, riot control agents, and herbicides like Agent Orange drew international criticism. It goes on to talk about that. And then it summarizes the controversy by saying the entire experimental legacy is dismaying. From the hundreds of dead monkeys at Fort Detrick to the spectacle of Seventh-day Adventist soldiers, the vaccinated volunteers in Project Whitecoat strapped to chairs amid cages of animals in the Utah sunlight as Q fever aerosols are blown over them. And most chilling are the mock scenarios played out in urban areas. Light bulbs filled with simulated biological weapon agents being dropped in New York subways, men in Washington National Airport spraying pseudo-biological weapons from briefcases, and similar tests in California and Texas and over the Florida Keys. So as we look at that, that we have a very long history of experimentation, ostensibly only going back to 1950 or so, the end of World War II and the outset of the Cold War, which links it to both the Nazis and the Soviet bloc. One question is it potentially possible that something like the Spanish flu outbreak, which took place in 1918, 1919, was an early experiment with biological warfare that predates the Cold War.
Oh, absolutely. I think so, as a matter of fact, because with American entry into World War One, this is the nasty part of World War One that nobody ever really talks about. You know, the Germans introduced poison gas, chemical warfare in 1915, I think it was. The Allies quickly, you know, caught up, and everybody was gassing each other. But in addition to this, there were biological weapons research being done by all combatants in World War One. The Central Powers did this, the Allies did this, and the idea back then was, can we put biological pathogens in artillery shells, just like gas shells, and bombard the enemy? So there's no doubt in my mind, Daniel, that with American entry into World War One, not only is there a push to expand America's chemical warfare's capability, but that there probably was an equal push, probably highly classified and probably classified to this day, to create biological weapons. And again, you know, biological warfare of that sort is not new to World War One. The ancients did this. You know, they take diseased animals that were suffering from this or that plague, put them on the catapults and lob them into, you know, a city to create a plague inside a city that they were laying siege to. So this is not new, and therefore we would have to argue by parity of reasoning that something like this is bound to occur in World War One as well, and I think it did. And that Fort Riley thing, I think, is absolute testament to that fact. The other thing that you're pointing out here is that there has been a pattern on the part of this government against its own citizenry of testing these weapons, sometimes covertly, sometimes ostensibly with the knowledge of the participants, but the participants never being given full knowledge. I want to mention some additional things to your list here just to drive this point home for people. In the, I think it was the 1960s, late 50s or 60s, the Atomic Energy Commission sponsored a program where Quaker Oats was laced with radiation, with radioactive ingredients in the Boston area to test, again, how this would spread. And, you know, the population was never made aware of this. We've got the famous Tuskegee experiments with syphilis on black soldiers, again, without their knowledge or consent. We have now, I think, clear evidence with some of the spraying that is taking place, the so-called chemtrails out in the southwestern part of the United States, that there's some sort of clear link between this and people that suffer Morgellons disease. I have a friend in West Hollywood that suffers Morgellons, and he sent me the pictures of his lesions and these strange fibers that are growing in these lesions. So they're still doing something to people without their knowledge and consent. And this is the point. This is all in aid of a bioweapons program that I find kind of frightening, that they would be willing to let this stuff out on a general population to see, you know, whatever it is that they want to see. So I have no problem with the Spanish flu epidemic being perhaps an early bioweapon that may have gotten out of control somehow. I really don't.
Well, it's interesting that over the July 4th holiday this year, a man was crabbing in the Maurice River in New Jersey. And this is a very common activity in New York and New Jersey, to go crabbing, clamming. Ordinary people can go out and just dig up clams and pick up crabs and stuff like that. It's a thing, right? In the way that noodling or something like that may be in the South, getting catfish. So the Maurice River, he was crabbing there, and he contracted flesh-eating disease. And within essentially a day, it became clear that he might end up being a quadriplegic. He may lose all of his limbs. And before that, he was, just an ordinary guy. active enough to go out and go crabbing. And so the question becomes, what is flesh-eating disease doing floating around in the Maurice River or doing infecting crabs in the Maurice River? Now, the Maurice River is south of Long Island Sound. I mean, it's basically along the coast of the eastern United States. And so that would imply that if Plum Island, which is at the tip of Long Island, were the source of it, it would have had to have traveled with crabs or things that eat crabs south along the United States, along New York, around the Cape of Cape May in New Jersey, where the mouth of the Maurice River lets out, which isn't very plausible because I don't know that they would go upriver, but if crabs, apparently they go far enough upriver that you can crab there, so maybe it is plausible. So I started looking at that, got me interested in this whole topic, the combination of the flu post you did and the flesh-eating disease over the July 4th holiday. Like, what are we doing with flesh-eating disease? It's like discovering anthrax in mice in Kansas under a barn, or Ebola. What's it doing there in Utah? So flesh-eating disease. Well, in one of the first notable contractions of flesh-eating disease was not until 1994. The premier of Quebec, Canada, got it, and he was the leader of the federal opposition party, the Quebecois Party, and he lost a leg from it. Later on, the former agent and partial owner of the San Diego Padres and Arizona Diamondbacks got it. Later on, Eric Cornell, the winner of the 2001 Nobel Prize in Physics, got it. Another experimental physicist, particle physicist, Alexandru Marin, got it in 2005. A number of British writers and journalists and historians have gotten this. The guitarist for Slayer got it. And a Canadian science fiction writer, Peter Watts, got it and commented that this was the ideal disease for a science fiction writer to get because it's literally a flesh-eating disease. It goes on, and other singer-songwriters, people that are sort of at the pinnacle of cultural expression, again, for rock and roll bands, and other politicians got it. So, for instance, in 2015, an Estonian politician got the disease on a trip to Thailand. Now, ostensibly, all of this seems normal, except that it's interesting that there's a cluster of these notable things. If you ask who was notable that did it, it seems to be around politicians, physicists, rock and roll band leaders, and authors and journalists, a disproportion, or people writing about science fiction, which is in many ways the journalism of the future. And so one of my questions becomes, is it possible that some of these diseases, like flesh-eating disease, that you didn't really hear much about prior to 94, are a result, in fact, of intentional testing or intentional targeting of plausible deniability of certain cultural icons like that are simply in the way or disruptive, or it would be convenient to get rid of?
Absolutely, I think it's possible, and I'll tell you why. I'm writing a book right now, as you know, on a topic that is fairly popular in alternative research, but I'm trying to write it from kind of a philosophical point of view. And as a consequence of that, I began looking at rock music groups. And I ran across a book by David McGowan called Weird Scenes. I don't know if you're familiar with the book, but if you're interested in the whole Laurel Canyon rock music scene, that's definitely a book to read, because he points out something that I had, I'd been aware of some of these things, but I just didn't make any of the connections. He points out that virtually every group that was associated in some fashion with the Laurel Canyon scene, with Frank Zappa and people like this, we're talking groups like the Byrds, the Monkees, Buffalo Springfield, the Beach Boys, the Doors, and so on and so forth. Very famous groups back in their day, that every one of them had some member of the group. In Jim Morrison's case, the most obvious connection there being to his dad, the admiral that was involved in the Gulf of Tonkin incident. But in every one of these groups' cases, you had some connection not only to the military industrial complex, but in some cases, even Frank Zappa himself, a chemical weapons engineer who had spent time at one of the bases of the U.S. Army that was involving some of these chemical weapons and biological weapons. So, in other words, the connection is there. So, it would not surprise me if you have the development of certain types of strains of flesh-eating disease or what have you, that you target individuals that you want to get rid of or take out of action, so to speak, and create the perfect plausible deniability by, well, they suffered this disease and now they're no longer active. Because you see this pattern very definitely in the Laurel Canyon rock music scene. So it does not surprise me. And again, I go back to what I said earlier. If DARPA is working on a universal vaccine, it's going to want to try to create the most virulent strains of different types of diseases as possible in order to test any potential vaccine that they may come up with, a potential universal vaccine against this stuff. So I have no difficulty, again, believing that this is possible and feasible. In fact, I think a lot of what we're seeing with these strange diseases, flesh-eating disease, mad cow disease, another one, the Morgellons disease, the so-called disease that doesn't exist, I have no problem thinking that a lot of this stuff is some sort of bioweapons testing that they're doing in aid of this DARPA project to inoculate anybody against everything.
Jeff Hanneman, whether Jeff Hanneman or Daniel Gillenlow were associated with Laurel Canyon or not, it would might be something for our listeners to go ahead and research. Shouldn't be too
absolutely,
hard.
absolutely. That again, that book by David McGowan is quite an eye opener. It's well worth, if people are interested in rock music and the rock scene, particularly in that era, and its connections to CIA projects. And this project in particular, I think, was also kind of a social engineering project, because he points out that the lyrics of these groups tend to be absolutely avoiding any sort of political commentary whatsoever. So if you're interested in that, definitely get that book, because there's something definitely going on there.
Well, it should be said that, flesh-eating disease can be contracted with open wounds exposed to seawater and from eating certain raw shellfish and raw species. So there are potentially natural explanations, and we don't mean to minimize anyone's suffering or whatever, but at the same time, there does seem to be an odd cluster of these happenings. So, I mean, if a bunch of bankers start disappearing, then you start wondering. So I have just a couple more questions. So one is, and then we'll call it a wrap for today. Here's my core question. First, I'm going to read one paragraph, which is it's about Kennedy's health during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's talking about the doctor that treated him, Travell. Travell's prescription records also confirm that during his presidency, and in particular during times of stress such as the Bay of Pigs fiasco, in April of 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, Kennedy was taking an extraordinary variety of medications: steroids for his Addison's disease, painkillers for his back, antispasmodics for his colitis, antibiotics for urinary tract infections, antihistamines for allergies, and on at least one occasion an antipsychotic, though only for 2 days, for a severe mood change that Jackie Kennedy believed had been brought on by the antihistamines. Now, it's well known that Kennedy's various illnesses were first surfaced essentially back in the 1940s, and that other members of the Kennedy family, cousins, nieces, etc., also have Addison's disease and other spin-offs of that disease. There's a hereditary factor going on there, and of course we can't deny that. But given everything that we've seen about the anti-Castro movement and the willingness to use germ warfare, but specifically a type of germ warfare that simulates illness and that is resistant to medication. Those were two of the criteria for the shift at the time in germ warfare studies, from things that were detectable as germ warfare to things that could be passed as ordinary illness. I can't help but recall that one of the common concerns expressed by Kennedy himself, also by Jimmy Carter, is, there seems to be an almost amoral approach to biological warfare when brought to them by the intelligence apparatus, and when we're talking about somebody who isn't American. Can we do this to Guatemala or something? The answer comes back and came back from Kennedy and Carter that their main concern was that it would backfire and the U.S. would receive sort of an international black mark as being a germ warfare state, and that we couldn't do that. But so their main concern was getting caught. That's disappointing. But it prompted precisely that focus on things that could be passed off as something else. So here comes the question of the day that I've been saving up. If the anti-Castro movement planned germ, this is the right-wing anti-communist movement, planned germ, biological, and chemical warfare against Castro, why wouldn't they also plan it against Kennedy himself when Kennedy betrayed them?
Exactly.
Exacerbating his illnesses, potentially making medicines ineffective, potentially putting him off his rocker, all the things they plan to do to Castro that would be passed off as something other than biological warfare. Before they would assassinate, why wouldn't they attempt this? It seems logical. So the question becomes, is it not only logical, but is it plausible?
Oh, yeah, I think it's absolutely plausible. Kennedy... This was, as you know, this was a big secret that the Kennedy family kept. It was the state of his health, and the same thing with Roosevelt. But in Kennedy's case, I've always been suspicious about the degree to which he was suffering all of these things. And again, he's got a very narrow circle of physicians attending him. And we find this pattern of very suspicious deaths for very simple reasons. Senator McCarthy, for example, had a very suspicious death at Bethesda Naval Hospital, as did Secretary Forrestal. So I've been wondering the same thing as you. Were these people targeted with these biological weapons in order to remove them from the scene? And Kennedy, as you say, would be a perfect target for it. And there's another reason why I think your scenario is very, very plausible here. If you go back to Hitler from 1940, late 42, all the way to the end of the war, is being treated by basically doctors that are quacks, and they're doping him up on all of this stuff to basically maintain him. But in actual fact, I entertain the idea that by this point in the war, he is so addle-minded and on so many different drugs and hormones and what have you, that he's basically non-functional. And my question is, all right, who would be in a position to take Hitler out of the picture by keeping him drugged? And that would be Martin Bormann. So again, the pattern is there in history. So I don't find your speculation in Kennedy's case that difficult to believe at all. And let's remember, Kennedy was a very good friend, close friend with Secretary Forrestal. So in other words, you've got this circle of people in and around Kennedy that were victims, I think, of some of this medical malfeasance. And I even wrote this in the Hess book about Rudolf Hess, is that he apparently was a victim of this type of stuff toward the end of his life in Spandau prison. There's a famous incident where his son visits him, and his father is just so mentally out of it, but he's in the British military hospital at the time and clearly being drugged up with something to make him, totally non-functional. So I don't find your scenario here difficult to believe at all. I think it highly likely, in fact.
Well, I was looking the other day. I was doing a survey of lost civilizations, not lost civilizations, but civilizations. What what am I trying to say? Communities that disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
And we may do an upcoming episode on that because I have some questions that have developed. And as you know, one of the most famous of those communities that disappeared, there are signs of radiation in one such instance, as though a targeted nuclear strike occurred on ancient soil. And so it struck me that most of our narrative about pandemics around the flu in particular start around 1580. But in fact, there's evidence that the ancient Romans knew and had the flu, that the ancient Greeks before them had the flu, that they understood this influenza type or influenza-like pandemic very well, and that it was equally a killer among ancient man. And so my question becomes, you've talked about in your books ancient weapons that utilize physics, the Giza Death Star. And so you would have an easy explanation for the presence perhaps of radiation, I would think, in the ancient world. But my question is, a civilization that was advanced enough, or one might say amoral or evil enough to develop a weapon of destruction of that capacity, wouldn't it be possible that they would develop also ancient biowarfare?
Oh,
there
absolutely.
would be biological weapons that far back that would also potentially simulate diseases that we might inherit today.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, there is a book that I referenced in Genes, Giants, Monsters, and Men on precisely that topic, on ancient biological warfare and the weaponization of pathogens. This was well known to them, and in fact, if you look at some of the Vedic texts, the Mahabharata talks about biological weapons, illnesses, weaponized diseases. I think you even find small references to it in the Ramayana. So it's there in the Vedic texts. There were clearly efforts at biological warfare, as I said before, when they would take diseased animals and fling them in catapults into cities, attempting to make the population defending the city sick. So this is not a new thing at all. And with respect to the Giza Death Star hypothesis, one of the things I pointed out in those books was the carbon dating of the mortar in the Great Pyramid is very unusual, because the mortar at the top of the pyramid is older than the mortar at the bottom of the pyramid. And the only, it's not that they built it top down. What that really is signaling is that there's a radioactive source inside the pyramid, and the shielding is skewing the dating between the lower part of the pyramid and the upper part. So in other words, if they know about radiation, it doesn't take much to hypothesize that they were able to use radioactive materials as part of their chemical weapons agenda. Uranium occurs naturally. You go out, get enough of it, and you make people sick. So I don't have any difficulty with the idea at all of ancient biological warfare. And there's the famous case of Mohenjo-Daro in India, where this whole city looks like it had been wiped out by some sort of nuclear weapon, possibly a radiological weapon, who knows. But again, I think the evidence is there. I have no difficulty with any of these scenarios that you're proposing.
Okay, so I have one last random question, and then we can wrap it up. And so this has to do with the article that you wrote featuring the piece about Dinkin and Christensen and the JFK assassination. The guys that independently reported overhearing the plot and were both summarily placed in mental institutions. I did some looking around on the internet and found only a small handful of sources that were talking about this. And one of those was the Mary Farrell Foundation. And I was just curious if you knew about the Mary Farrell Foundation and knew anything about it and had any thoughts about it.
No, I don't know anything about. I did read that piece that you sent. I don't know anything about it and what that is all about. I do think it is very suspicious that this revelation came in that tranche of documents that Trump recently declassified, where these two military personnel are mentioned as having overheard in the chatter in the teletypes, that overheard allegedly chatter about an assassination plot against President Kennedy. And what I found very interesting is probably what you found interesting, and that is both of these military service personnel were involved in signals intelligence. In other words, they were cryptographers, they had access to classified communications, and so on and so forth. And both of them ended up being put into mental institutions for their claims. And then subsequently, the Mary Farrell article points out that neither the FBI nor the CIA followed up on these two gentlemen in the aftermath of the assassination in the Warren report. So I find it very suspicious. As far as I'm concerned, that's kind of the nail on the coffin. That if there's chatter in military intelligence that an assassination plot is bubbling, that to my mind just shot Fletcher Prouty, Colonel Prouty's allegations about the security stripping that took place on the day of the assassination around President Kennedy. For so many years he was out there basically all alone maintaining this, and now we've got some support that there was some sort of knowledge on the part of the military that this was going to take place, and it was ignored. It was deliberately shut down. So there's plausible deniability again. They ship them off to the psychiatric institutions to make sure that people think, well, these guys were nuts, so we can't pay any attention to what they had to say.
Well, so lots of people are asking about this stuff, and we'll try to get this show up in the members area pretty darn quick. Dr. Farrell, I think you have to go. You have another interview tonight.
Yeah, I have another interview tonight, and I apologize about that. I completely neglected when I scheduled the interview to look at the schedule to see that we were scheduled to do a dialogue today, so I apologize about the shortness of this. But
I think people like them short. I think it's okay.
Well, it may be okay, but yeah, there's lots to talk about the vaccine issue. Robert Kennedy Jr., as you know, has just come out with claims about the CDC. You sent an article from Atlantic that I thought was kind of interesting about that. But yeah, there's all sorts of stuff going on right now, and as far as I'm concerned, at this stage I don't trust big pharma as far as I can throw it. But anyway, that's perhaps another dialogue for another day.
Well, we'll get this up in the member section. Thank you, Dr. Farrell.
Yep,
we'll
thank you,
return
sir.
you to your regularly scheduled broadcast.
All right, thank you.